Hi everybody, my name is Jacque Patterson. I am with an organization called August Jackson. We're an agency, we're a brand experience agency, and we focus on things like events, campaigns, and we do some consulting as well. And one of the things I do at AJ is lead one of our consulting practices related to organizational culture. So I love culture, I'm fascinated with it, I study it, and I work with clients to really help them think about their organizational cultures and figure out how to influence those and use them to drive all sorts of things. Most of my clients are marketers, why it's really interesting to be here today talking to all of you. It's not necessarily always the HR folks or the talent folks that I'm talking to when it comes to culture. It's usually marketing people, communications people, and leadership in terms of the work that we do around organizational culture. So when it comes to culture, how do you define culture, right? It's this very, very abstract thing. So if you think about it, it's a hard thing to describe because it's a very, very abstract concept. So we call it an abstraction, and it's yet it has stability, right? So it's one of those things that's bigger than any one person. If one person leaves the organization, often the entire culture does not change. While there might be some influence, there's some structural stability to something like culture. And we talk about culture and we observe culture through things like stories, symbols, and rituals. So when we're doing work with clients and we're trying to understand what the culture is from a baseline standpoint and where we want to take the culture, we usually dive in, almost like an anthropologist, into the stories that they tell. So those are the narratives. What are people saying? How is leadership communicating? What are the talk tracks? What are the speeches? What are the cadences of communication? Stories, what are the stories that are being told throughout the organization? Symbols are the things that are on the walls, the artifacts that exist within the organization. And rituals are things like, rituals, things that we do. A lot of times I look at process when we're trying to understand sort of what some of those rituals are so that we understand sort of what people are doing on a day-to-day basis. And these are the types of things that help us understand what a culture is. So, before I get too much farther into it, I want to tell a little story, or give an example. Does anybody know who Simon Sinek is? Familiar with Simon Sinek? Okay, yes. Okay, I'm a total fan. And I heard Simon Sinek speak last summer at a conference that was amazing. Simon Sinek, for those of you who don't know, is a speaker, author. He wrote a book a few years ago called Start With Why, which is all about purpose and certainly very, very relevant, and had a new book come out last fall called The Infinite Game. And in chapter 6 of The Infinite Game, Simon talks about an experience he had with a barista at the Four Seasons in Las Vegas. Does anybody know this story? No? Okay. So it's just, it's him recounting this experience that he had going to grab coffee at the hotel, and Noah, the barista, the way he interacted with him was so unique that Simon stopped and said, "Wow, you must really like your job." And Noah turned and said, "I love my job." And Simon said, "Wow, that's a really powerful thing to say, right? Yeah, love is a very, very, very powerful emotion. Why do you love your job?" And the reasons Noah gave are really interesting. He said, I've worked at a lot of hotels in Las Vegas, as you can imagine. That's quite a prevalent industry. I've worked at lots of different hotels. And here at the Four Seasons, my manager knows everything about me. I walk down the hallways and everybody knows my name. And I know why I'm here. I know that serving you coffee is so important to your day. So he told the story about basically how he's so entrenched in the purpose of the organization and how that transcends into the culture. And so employees who are bringing the culture to life like that are good for the brand. So Simon walked away saying, "Man, I love the Four Seasons," right? Now, that's not a terribly hard stretch, right? Four Seasons is a luxury brand, and so that makes a lot of sense. But he had this really unique experience that was all about culture and the way this particular employee brought the culture to life in a way that really brought the brand to life. So how do you build that, right? So that's a great example. We're not all the Four Seasons, and we all have different businesses, but culture is really, really important. And we talked about it earlier, how it's an abstraction. And so while it's abstract, it's sort of hard to sort of pin down, right? And the other thing, too, that's happening in the world today is that we've got networked organizations. We have people all over the place. Hierarchies and org charts aren't necessarily how people communicate and how culture grows and is transitioned. So that ever fluid, ever changing dynamic is making culture a hard thing to pin down. So how do you influence it? And we, at August Jackson, when we're working with clients around culture, we start with purpose. That is where we go first. And that is the number one thing that you do, is you start with purpose. And we look at purpose as the North Star. That's literally how we describe it. It's why you're here. It's what's driving you. So when we're sitting with our clients and talking about, the North Star, we use tools to help sort of extract that and to really understand and dive deep into what the purpose is. Why does not only your organization exist, but what your brand exists, or why is this campaign important, or why is this particular change important when we're doing change management work? We really dive into that, and we say we start with purpose, and that is literally the starting point for any culture work that we do. I have another story. Let me see. There we go. And another story that relates to this. So DTE Energy, which is a Fortune 500 company, energy company based in Michigan, and the story of Jerry Anderson, who took over as CEO in the early 2000s at DTE Energy. And when Jerry Anderson came on board, he was a hard and fast Wall Street guy who looked at his job as CEO to be all about delivering value to shareholders, no matter what. Financially driven, bottom line, the numbers and the dollars of the bottom line, no matter what. And so that was fine, right? He comes on board, he gets the employee engagement surveys. They're terrible, right? People hate working there. It's very prevalent. He didn't really care. And then in 2008, as we all know, we hit a recession and their profits plummeted. And he sort of pulled from his toolbox all the tricks that he had to sort of drive profitability, and they weren't working. And so a board member tapped him on the shoulder and said, Jerry, I'd like you to go visit the call center at USAA. So if anybody knows USAA, it's an insurance company for veterans, military families. And so this board member took Jerry Anderson to visit the call center at USAA, and what he found, he was struck by what he found. People in this call center who were engaged, who were smiling, who were moving around, who were really, really happy with what they were doing. And he asked the board member, this is really interesting to see, these people so engaged in what can be considered sort of dry work, a call center in an insurance company. And this board member said, it is a leader's job to connect people to purpose. So at USAA, the people in the call center were so in tune with why they were there and what they were doing for these military families that it was very, very moving. And so Jerry Anderson went back to DTE, went back to Detroit, and the first thing he did was created a video that he, to talk about the purpose of DTE Energy. And it was all about empowering people and giving people the power in Michigan to live their lives. He released this video, and it was received with tears, right? Salty union guys who had been doing this for years were reduced to tears. They were so moved by this video. And what followed was a series of activities, town halls, communications, changes in the way the business operated that was really, really focused on culture. And what happened as a result, as you might imagine, is their engagement scores skyrocketed. They were a best place to work 5 years in a row. They're still on that list. Their profits tripled from 2008 to 2017. So the financial results were really there. And this is one of many stories that we hear in terms of why culture is important and how it can really drive business. And it can also drive marketing. So, there's some recent data that talks about that purpose, and why customers are responding to purpose and culture and the culture that sort of transcends. So, 79% of people say they're more loyal. 67% of people say they're more apt to forgive a brand if they believe they've got purpose, and that's coming through. And that happens, right, in this day and age of crisis and uncertainty. Mistakes happen. We'll talk in a minute about some of those things. They're more apt to promote the brand, and they're more apt to share content around the brand. So, I've been saying this for the last probably 10 days, like literally all day long, every day. It's getting weird, Purpose is more important than ever. We are living in a really weird time, in my opinion. Obviously, everything that's going on with COVID-19 is really impacting us as a nation, as a globe. this is a really interesting time to be navigating organizational issues, brand issues, marketing issues. There's political uncertainty. It's an election year, right? Anytime that happens, that creates some uncertainty in the way that our work goes and the way people respond to brands. And then crisis. Crisis happens. Look at organizations like Boeing, Uber, Wells Fargo, right? Stuff happens all the time. And when these things happen and when things get weird, culture can be an anchoring mechanism. So we talk about this a lot. And that when you are faced with a crisis, that culture or your values, purpose, those really, really important things that provide stability can be a shelter in the storm. They can really guide you in the right direction. And so we've been doing a lot. We've been having a lot of conversations over the past couple of weeks, as you might imagine, with our clients around culture and how to use culture as a lens to make decisions. How do we respond to COVID-19? What do? Do we send people home? Do we keep them here? What happens to our brand? What should we be saying on social media? All of these types of things, when we're having those conversations, we're anchoring back to culture and to purpose and asking why, and really sort of helping our clients to take that lens when making these decisions. All right, so I've talked about culture, and I've talked about why it's important, and wanted to share a few tips, right? A couple things that you could take away with you today as you think about this back at your own organization. And the first one is no surprise. It's that you start with purpose. So if you don't have a stated purpose in your organization, work to get one, right? Ask the right questions. Control what you can control. Figure out, how can we define purpose for this campaign or for this brand or for this project? Really work to define that. And we say if you can do that, then it's going to guide you as you move forward. So starting with purpose is the number one thing. We have a tool called a purpose platform, and so what we do is we help clients, identify what that purpose is and sort of identify who the key stakeholders are in the purpose, and then do some activity around sort of what they're thinking, feeling, and doing, so that we can really help to define it. And we're happy to share those tools with you. So that's a great place to start. And then the second thing we talk about is aligning people practices. So when it comes to building purpose or building culture, you start with purpose, right? And we have a framework that we talk about and that we use with our clients. It's up here for all of you to certainly take back to your offices with you. It's a model that talks about purpose and how you align your people practices within your organization to drive culture. And so let me tell you a little bit about that. So thinking about purpose in the middle, the people practices. So thinking about things like talent. Who are the people that are working at your organization? What's your leadership? What are your hiring practices? Development. This is probably a little hard to see, but development is the next one here. How are you developing leaders? What's the career path at your organization? What does the future look like for people that are working for you? Organizational structure are things like hierarchy. It's also how decisions are made. Communications. So clearly the way you communicate, the communication tools you use, all of those are things to consider. And then the last one is recognition. And when we work with clients and we go in and we look at all of these things to sort of understand where they are from a cultural standpoint, recognition, reward, pay, compensation is usually the thing I see that's most out of whack. So when we think about this model and we want to help organizations align culture, we help them think about all these things to make sure they're working harmoniously, right? So if you've got espoused values and things on the wall and things your leaders are saying about the organization and the organization's purpose, but then you pay or reward or measure performance on something else, that flies in the face, and it can have an adverse effect. It happens all the time. It's probably the most common thing I see. And so when we think about culture, we look at all of these things and we make sure that they're aligned, right? And that makes a huge difference. When we do this, we see engagement scores skyrocket. We see brands flourish. It really does work. And so I would urge you, if you are thinking about culture at your organization, think about these things and how they all work together. I would also say as marketers, it's really important to work with your talent folks on this type of stuff, right? There are things in here that are often driven by talent functions within the organization. So I think it's a really, really important partnership that's not always in place. And so making sure there's good connectivity between talent and marketing. Okay. And with that, I'm just about finished. That's my overview of culture and purpose and why it's important to marketers. August Jackson, just quickly, you know, we are an organization. We help brands put purpose into practice, and like I said, we do that through events and communication and consulting. And if you want to hear anything more about us, Brittany's here, I'm here today. We've got blogs, we've got a lot of thought leadership out there. We've got more coming this week on Culture Through a Crisis. We have a ton of stuff that's already been published this week around events. We do a lot of work in the event space, and we've been talking to a lot of our clients around what they're doing with their events, going virtual, you know, postponing. There are lots of different options, how the messaging might be different. We have a ton of stuff that's out there, so I would encourage anybody who's interested in that type of messaging, take a look at our website, let us know. We're happy to share some of our thoughts around that. I know, right? I know, it's really, so we are in real time working with clients on this, and it is very real. And so there is, what we're talking a lot about is the technology, right? So that's sort of the first item of business is the technology to do that. So we happen to have at our agency, we use Zoom for like everything, and we already do because we have people that are all over the place, and so we're very used to it. And one of the things we've been telling our clients is, you know, get the technology in place, and that's not an easy thing to do overnight, but there are lots of technology companies that are at the ready to help with this. And you know, one of the most simple things that we talk about when we talk about this virtual sort of workforce is the video aspect of it, right? So often people are using WebEx or using Zoom and they don't have the video on. So we find just that face-to-face interaction and getting people used to, you know, showing their face and being able to have human interaction. There is something really powerful, I think, in that ongoing interaction and being able to see people's faces. And it's a very simple thing. So talking about, you know, if we're getting the tools in place, and then as you use those tools, what are some of the ground rules and rules of the road that you as an organization deem really important? For us, we have a mandatory work from home that went into place today. So one of the things we've told our people is video's always on. Video's always on. Think about your background. Be dressed, right, for work, because you never know when a client's going to call. You know, be available, you know, during working hours. We also use Slack. So we're saying, you know, if you can't stop somebody in the hallway, use Slack. We're doing some things at our organization with some virtual lunches, right? Some things that we can't do because we're not in the office. So we're opening up some Zooms at noon, a couple days a week, where people can just like grab their lunch and at least sort of like talk to each other. If they want to, we'll give some updates, but nothing too formal. So things like that. Yep.
When you're looking to drive organizational change and kind of with a culture-driven approach, what stakeholders or level of management will you typically work with?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about that in the panel as well. Stephanie, who's with us, is a change expert. But it's sort of, I feel, it depends on the change, right? So it depends. I think if it's a huge change, like an organizationally wide change, you need to start with the leadership, right? And that's usually where I start. I try to go the highest level that I can when starting there, so that we've got alignment at the top. Because if that doesn't happen, as you probably all know, it can fall flat, right? If there's not leadership support, priorities can shift, and it's very, very hard to sort of make change stick. So we usually look at that. When I look at stakeholders for a change, I really look at primary, secondary, tertiary, and really sort of think about, okay, who are the highest level, you know, leaders that we can get engaged, you know, to the change, and also going deep in terms of who are all the people that this could possibly affect, and sometimes you're surprised by that, right? You know, in terms of especially some of those tertiary ones, and just making sure not to overlook anybody. So I would say, get, you know, the buy-in at the highest level you can, and then be sure you're really thinking holistically about everybody that could be affected. No.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
And then we can, while we're doing that, if we can get the chairs on stage for the panel, that would be perfect.
Great. So it's clear that you work with organizations. I was wondering if you guys also do purpose and change management within healthcare systems, like IDNs, or just like healthcare groups?
We have some healthcare-focused clients. So we do. So what's interesting in the way we work with healthcare companies in a few different ways at our organization. So we happen to have a sort of broad set of capabilities. We work with some hospital systems and healthcare systems on change. And the work that I've done in hospital systems is really fun. It's really interesting work because it's usually very purpose-driven, and nurses and doctors, there's a very, very high purpose in healthcare. And so we've done a little bit of work around that in terms of how to engage physicians. We've done some projects around that. We do some fundraising work. So we have a group that does consulting and events around fundraising. And we work with hospital systems in that respect too, in terms of how are you engaging your donors, your people, right, to get behind sort of a higher level mission that from a fundraising point of view. So does that answer your question? Yeah.